Hugh, so much for being here.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it, and it's an honor to be here. I admit that I have struggled a little bit with this presentation, and I think it's because it's hard to speak with authority on this subject when you're speaking to a statewide audience, because there is a great deal of variability as to what kinds of supports are available and what's available in the communities depending on where you live. And so I decided today to spend most of my time on something that I know best, and that's parent support. I'm not going to spend much time at all talking about various community supports. If anybody has any questions about that, they can certainly talk to me after this or send an email. One of the things when we were planning this event, Tim asked us to consider how the worlds of autism and other developmental disabilities interact with mental health. For me, they were, not only did they interact, they intertwined. My son was hyperlexic. What that means is that he was able to read at a very young age with no instruction. When we first learned this, he was about, it was before he was 3, he was playing in our backyard, and we had a welcome mat that spelled out the word welcome. And I walked by, I was inside, he was outside on the patio, and I walked by and I heard him say O-M-E. And I stopped and I said, say that again. And he spelled out the whole word, W-E-L-C-O-M-E. We had not, at that point in time, we weren't teaching him his letters at all. We discovered that not only did he know all of his uppercase letters, he knew all of his lowercase letters as well. I have no idea how he learned that. He, at the age of 3, he picked up his older sister's first reader and read the whole thing to us. So when this was a really interesting, it was fascinating to us, and it was really an interesting strength for him. And when he was in kindergarten, he was very much accepted by his peers because he could read stories to them, and the rest of the kids couldn't. So we wanted to really build on that strength, and so we worked with the school, or talked to the school several times about designing a special reading program for him. We wanted this to continue to be a strength for him. After numerous attempts, we were finally flatly told, we do not cross-categorize kids. Meaning that if you're a special ed student, you can't also get specialized reading designed by the gifted and talented teacher. At the time, I don't think that I knew enough on how to fight or advocate for my son, and we ended up accepting that, and within 2 years, everyone else's reading had caught up to his, and it was no longer a strength of his. And but I remember being pretty infuriated and thinking to myself that, you know, we're not talking about sorting coins here or bolt sizes or anything like that. We're not easily categorized. And so to me, I think that the fact that we categorize kids, even in autism and mental health and developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities, you know, they're all really kind of artificial constructs. And if you look at the diagnostic process, particularly for mental health diagnoses, kids often have migrating diagnoses as they present differently over time. In the DSM-5, there are over 20 different disorders that have irritability as a hallmark symptom. You know, which one is it? So there really is, you know, it's a label that we're placing on based on certain characteristics that we believe are common in a particular disorder. You know, right now, today, we're learning a whole lot more, and I'm certainly not very well versed on brain science, but we do know that there are more and more advanced techniques being developed that help us see what's going on with functional MRIs in the brain, and with other kinds of scanning techniques. And so now we can see some certain structural differences within certain kids, and we can see some functioning differences. Eventually, maybe we're going to have more definitive diagnostic capability through some of that, but today we really don't, and it's still kind of a trial and error with a lot of these diagnoses. So, long rambling beginning to saying that, you know, at Wisconsin, what we do is we care a lot less about the diagnostic label, and we try to look at common characteristics. And on this slide are some of the common characteristics that we see quite often across kids who carry a wide variance of diagnostic labels. Is that everybody else's kind of experience as well? And because of that, that fact, you know, I think that we as, you know, because we're challenged by these categories, we at Wisconsin Family Ties, we decided to change how we refer to the population we serve. We talk about working with families that include kids with social, emotional, or behavioral challenges, and not referring to just mental health or just a particular diagnosis. Another way that I believe that these worlds interact is that many of the difficulties that our kids face are primarily due to skill issues rather than willful behavior decisions that they're making. Quite often, particularly those kids who don't wear their disability on their face, that you can't. If you walked by them on the street, you would not know that they had some sort of underlying challenge. Often when there are behavioral challenges with a child like that, they're viewed as being bad kids, problems, manipulative, coercive, attention-seeking, and but we believe, and we think the research bears out, that it's far more likely that in the vast majority of cases, those challenges are due to skill deficits. And what I've done today, since we can't get into some details, I've parenthetically put in some other people who have been very instrumental in promoting these kinds of concepts that if you so choose, you could go and Google them and find lots of materials about that issue. Ross Green in particular has done an awful lot of work around rethinking how we view kids and those kids who have behavioral challenges. Because my son had an autism diagnosis, when I started with Wisconsin Family Ties 14 years ago, I really knew nothing. And I feel like I know a little bit today after 14 years. There's so much to learn. But the things that I did know, the few things that I did know, were all autism-inspired interventions that had been used or were being used with my son. And so when I was working with families who had kids with more traditional mental health diagnoses, I often would relate some of the things that we used, and they're listed here on this slide. And interestingly enough, that fast forward a little more than a decade, and these are pretty standard kinds of things that are being used across a wide spectrum of diagnoses now, including more traditional mental health diagnoses. I don't know the makeup of this room, and I don't know the makeup of the people around the state, but clearly want to convey today that parenting can be a challenge, and parenting a neurotypical kid can be plenty challenging. But for us, the vast majority of the families that we work with are are normal, healthy families, but they're experiencing some extraordinary challenges. What we've discovered is that some of those good parenting skills that we're often told by others to use, and often told by others in rather inappropriate settings that we should use those skills, they don't often work when you have kids who have mental health needs. And finally, some of the disciplinary strategies that work with typically developing kids are not effective for behavior problems related to mental health. I can assure you that over the 14 years that I've been working at Wisconsin Family Ties and talking to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of parents across the state, if those things that are advocated in the books worked, we'd have the best behaving kids in the world, because they've tried everything. They've tried the 1, 2, 3 magic. They've tried the timeouts. They've tried all these things, and they don't typically work as well with kids with mental health challenges. I really tend to think that while these kids are often identified as being difficult or problematic, it's really us who have the difficulty. It's the adults. We have difficulty in understanding how best to support these kids. We have difficulty in understanding these kids. So I'm a big advocate of switching your perspective on how we view these kids. So let's talk a little bit about parent support. It's pretty clear that all parents need support, and that can come from a variety of sources. It can come from family, friends, other parents. It can come from providers, educators, etc. And these are some of the kinds of things listed on this slide here of the types of support that families can receive from others. Many of these points are kind of underpinned by what's called family-driven practice, and that's a view that parents are in the best position to make decisions, healthcare decisions regarding their kids, and so if they're the experts on those kids, then we ought to be tapping into that information and expertise that they have as we are working with that family, or as we are designing how we're going to work with their children. So, what can we all do to better support parents? I tried to limit this list because there's no end to a list that you could create on how we can support parents. But I really just want to focus on 2 of these. The first one, learn their stories. There was a research study that came out a number of years ago that concluded what we probably already intuitively know, is that humans are biologically hardwired to connect with each other. If that's true, and if we want to connect with someone, then our job is to find out their story. And everyone has a story, and their story might be quite different than what you first think it might be. And I remember a number of years ago at our office at Wisconsin Family Ties, there was a man who moved into the office next to us. It was a single office, and he was an attorney. And shortly after he moved into that office, we could smell cigarette smoke wafting through the walls into our office. We're in a non-smoking building. And so our first reaction was indignance. Who does this guy think he is, that he's coming into this building and flaunting the rules? Does he think they don't apply to him? And after a few days, even one of our staff called the landlord and said, "Hey, your new tenant's smoking in his office." And we were kind of outraged that someone could just feel so privileged that that the rules didn't apply to them. A few days later, there was a overnight delivery service that stopped at our door and said, "Hey, I've got an overnight delivery for this guy who's in the next office. He's not there right now. Would you guys be willing to take this?" And we said, "Sure." So he came, our neighbor, the next day came over to pick up his package that was left in our office. And in picking it up, introduced himself, and he says, the mission of your organization is really important to me, and we didn't want to be inappropriate and pry, but we just said thank you, and gave him his package. He went on his way. The next day, he came back and he asked if he could talk to me, and we went in my office and sat down, and he told me the story of his daughter who had an eating disorder and who just 18 months prior to that had died as a result. We had made all sorts of assumptions about this guy. He was arrogant. He didn't think the rules applied to him. You know what he really was? He was a father who was in pain. And I think of that story often and try to remind myself that, we don't know what everybody else is going through. And if we really took the time to learn their stories, we'd find out a much different set of facts than what we're assuming. And that's related to the fourth one, which is present alternatives to assumptions. So we all have, as I said, we all have this idea of what's going on with someone, what's going on with this kid who's misbehaving in school or misbehaving in the community or at home, or what their family life might be like. And there's almost always another very different picture of what's going on with that kid that is equally, if not more, plausible. And so at Wisconsin Family Ties, we call that the alternate narrative. And that's a lot of what we do, is we paint a different picture of what the possibilities are that are going on with this kid. And I really think that if we as adults could look at those kids and families from different perspectives and help present those possible alternate theories as to what's going on, that changes the dynamic. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So there was a young man who was in a psychiatric inpatient hospitalization, and when he would receive phone calls from his mother, after those phone calls, he would always act out and cause trouble on the unit. The staff actually said to us that, well, she's riling him up, and we only had to, our alternative narrative for that one was just one sentence. Isn't it equally possible that he misses home? If we just shifted that and looked at it from a different perspective, it changed totally what that behavior was like. We also had a situation where there was a young child who had drawn a picture on his teacher's chair with a permanent marker, and he got in trouble for it. And everybody was trying to figure out, how do we stop him from doing things like this and destroying others' property? When it was revealed that the picture he drew was of the teacher, it became apparent that it's possible that was a sign of affection that he had no other way of communicating. And that totally changed the perspective as well. So there's so much power in having an alternative picture of what's going on with these kids. And I'd really encourage all of us as adults to open ourselves up to that possibility. Are there any questions in the room so far? I feel like I'm rambling here. So I want to spend some time talking about a particular type of parent support, and that's parent-peer support. Family-run organizations started popping up in the mid-1980s for the most part, and they started providing this peer support, and that was the key element of this peer support, was this shared lived experience that we had experience that was similar to the population that we were serving. This peer support was developed because some of the more traditional services weren't necessarily meeting all of families' needs, and so that's how this all grew up. And while for the most part, peer support and parent peer support has been accepted as an important service, there have been some more recent attacks by some advocacy groups who favor a medical model over a non-medical model for working with kids and families. And even in some federal legislation that was introduced that painted peer and family-run organizations as being anti-treatment. We're not. And not only anti-treatment, but being undeserving of federal funding. So I wanted to just give you guys a few pieces, and I'm not going to go into any kind of detail, but there's a significant research base and an expanding research base supporting the use of parent peer support and peer support in general. And I'm just going to mention a few things that are going on or that have been completed, and then a few of the interesting research projects that are currently going on. This first research study was done at the University of Kansas, and this focused on child outcomes, and it noted that there were improvements where families had received peer support from other parents. There were improvements in living arrangements, school attendance, academic performance, law enforcement contact, and there were also fewer externalizing behaviors. Then there was a study that was done in Wisconsin and done by Deb Ramaker, who is now the associate director at Wisconsin Family Ties, and is hosting one of the remote sites here today. She did a study and of participants who had received parent-peer services from a family-run organization, and it didn't support as strong a link between to a behavior improvement as was reported in the Kansas study, but it did confirm improvement in academic performance, and it also focused on improvement in parental and family functioning that were rather impressive. And then most recently, last year, Wisconsin Family Ties, along with a couple of adult peer specialist organizations in our state, worked with the Medical College of Wisconsin and conducted some research on the view of peer services as reported by the service recipients. And some really interesting results came out of this. Of the 11 services options that were presented in this survey, peer support was most frequently ranked number 1 in terms of importance. I think that 87% rated the effectiveness of the peer support they received as highly effective or effective. 83% rated the quality as very high or high. So those are all pretty good numbers in the research world. The thing that probably struck us the most was the high degree of referral to other services. As I mentioned earlier, that there was some federal legislation that painted peer support as being anti-treatment, and the fact of the matter is that in 72% of the cases, the individuals who received peer support were also referred to other services. Of those who were referred to mental health services, their actual engagement rate for those mental health services was over 95%, which is almost unheard of. If you go to a primary care physician and they refer you to mental health services, the rate is believed to be, of engagement is believed to be somewhere south of 50%. So that was the huge outcome of this research. There are a couple of other things that are going on. We're working with the Department of Public Instruction right now to determine the degree to which parent-peer specialist services improve parental involvement in educational services, their perception of those services, and satisfaction with their child's school plan, as well as the student educational outcomes and teachers' perceptions as well. And that's a project that'll be going on through 2018. And then there are a couple of, and I'm sure that Tim will get these slides to everyone, there's a couple of national research projects that are going on to collect more information and data on the services that family-run organizations are providing, and then also studying the effect of parent-to-parent peer support on child and family outcomes. And some of these projects are being worked on by researchers who are nationally renowned and actually world renowned in their area of child mental health. So I didn't realize that was going to have a transition. So I decided to give you some information on a variety of organizations that provide parent support in the state. And I decided not to talk specifically about all of them, and if you guys are interested, you can contact them, look them up, and see what it is that they do. There's a variety of ways that parents receive support. Some of these are focused more on educational issues, such as Wisconsin Facets and WISPE, and others are more broad-based, and work with a wide variety of populations. But they're all fine organizations doing important work in our state, and I wanted to make sure that we recognized that. And I'm going to spend the rest of the few minutes that I've got talking just briefly about the work that we do at Wisconsin Family Ties and how we approach parent peer support. If we're to categorize the services that we provide, I would categorize them into these 4 buckets. We provide information and assistance, provide information on a wide variety of topics to families that are relevant to their needs. We provide education and training. Tim mentioned the Children Come First conference, but we do things in addition to that, but that's our flagship educational opportunity in the year. Advocacy. Quite often this term of advocacy has a negative connotation. That's not the way that we practice at all. Advocacy, the definition of it is the act of speaking on behalf of someone or something, and so oftentimes we have families that are so overwhelmed that they have difficulty being able to communicate what it is that they need, what it is that they think is going on, and they need support in doing that. And so we help them be able to do that. Our goal in doing that is to have families build better working relationships with the systems that are serving them. If we go into a particular situation and there's a conflict between a service system and a family, if we tried to address that in an adversarial way, it's possible that we could win on that particular issue, but when we walk away, we've left that family and that service system with no better ability to communicate when there are going to be future conflicts, and believe me, there will be future conflicts. So our goal is really to equip families with the tools and information that they need to be able to build those better working relationships with systems. We also work in an advocacy effort. We work on public policy issues relating to the population that we serve. And then finally, we provide emotional support to family. I read a number of years ago in a book, there was a phrase that said, hope is as essential to life as water and air. And we believe that at Wisconsin Family Ties, and that's really what we're in. We're in the hope business, and we work with families to help give them hope that things can get better and that there are things that they can do to address the challenges that they're facing right now. This next slide is a definition, how we define parent-peer specialist at Wisconsin Family Ties. And this is it's difficult to kind of understand the services that can be provided by a parent-peer specialist. They're pretty wide-ranging, and the way that we practice is that we work to help families get their needs met, whatever those needs may be. So we're not just, even though our population is focused on kids who have social, emotional, or behavioral challenges, we recognize that if those families are worried about whether the car's going to start in the morning, or where they're going to live next month, or what they're going to eat this weekend, that they're not going to be spending too much time thinking about how do I address Johnny's behavioral challenges in school. And And so we work with them to get them connected to all of the services and supports that can help them get those needs met. We think that's just the logical way of doing it. In addition to working with those families, we work with child-serving professionals, help them better understand the family perspective, identify strategies for working with children and youth with challenging behavior, and working with professionals to identify strategies for engaging families, especially those who have historically been pretty difficult to reach. Part of the work that we do is embodied in navigating systems. Kids who have mental health challenges tend to be involved in lots of different systems. Each one of these systems, complex in its own right, having their own sets of rules, really difficult to become an expert in all of those. And there are not a lot of good resources that comprehensively tell families and parents what rights they have within those various systems. And so that's a big part of the work that we do at Wisconsin Family Ties. So how are parent-peer specialists utilized in the community? This is a long laundry list. But again, in working with a service system, sometimes they don't know, well, who should we be referring to you? And so this kind of helps those service systems understand what are some of those situations where our services may be of benefit to families. And I'm just going to pick up on a couple of these here. Families that have few natural supports, that is extended family, close friends, a pastor or religious leader in the community, if they don't have connections with those, if they maybe just moved into a community and they need some support, we don't replace being that natural support for them, but we can work with them and help them develop some natural supports within the community. Often when we talk about kids who have mental health challenges, we're talking about challenging behaviors, and most often that happens in school settings. Schools are a pretty tough place for our kids. And so when a child is receiving exclusionary discipline of some sort, suspension, shortened school day, mom or dad being called from work to pick them up from school, those kinds of things, those are situations where we have particular expertise in being able to assist the family and the schools to work together to find more effective plans that can keep kids in school and being successful in school. And we also, I just wanted to run by real quickly that not only is that lived experience key in our organization to become a parent-peer specialist, but there's a significant amount of training involved. The first year, there's parent-peer specialist work as we practice it, and we practice it kind of similarly to a lot of other organizations like ours across the nation that we're connected to. You can't go to a college or university and get a degree in how to become a parent-peer specialist. So it's a little different than many other professions. And so in our first year, what we end up doing is having to hire people who have the right characteristics and then train them. So we have 168 hours of training in the first year alone. And then we have 88 hours of training in ongoing years. And we measure our proficiency based on a set of core competencies. Our core competencies, there are 54 separate competencies that are in 8 different domains, and again, that's how we measure the work that our parent-peer specialists do. These are just some of our practice values. We do follow a code of conduct that was specifically developed for the parent-peer specialist role. I don't think there's anything else that needs to be said about that. And finally, just to wrap up, some of you may be wondering, well, we don't have a parent peer specialist in our community. How do we get one of those? And I'm truly not trying to turn this into a sales pitch, but we have a fundamental belief at Wisconsin Family Ties that this work is valuable. We know that based on the research that we've done and the evaluations that we've done with the families that we've served, that they find significant value, and it changes their lives. And because it's a valuable service, we believe that the people who provide this should be well trained and should be paid to do so. And so we have a paid employee model. It's not a volunteer model. And so when we go into a particular area, we have to find sources of funding to be able to pay the people that we train and employ. These are some of the different ways that are sources of funding that can be used to work with Wisconsin Family Ties or other organizations that provide similar services to be able to fund it. So I thank you all for your time. I think I've met my time requirement, and Tim is going to come back and give you all instructions on how to carry on the discussions in your local sites.
Great. Thank you, Hugh. Let's give a round of applause. Prove to people that I am not here alone, which is great. Just a couple questions off the top of my head, because I know we're not yet at the technology where we're going to be able to take questions from sites. We're working toward that, but we thought we would try this YouTube thing first, and so we're working on it. Thank you very much.